Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is the Casual Friday podcast. In this week's podcast, I have tidbits, and I have a completed sweater using the hand-spun yarn that I made during last month's Tour de Fleece. So let's get started. This first tidbit came to me from Amber, who sent me the roving that I spun into yarn that I then knit into the sweater that I will be showing you in just a bit. So a few Casual Fridays ago, I mentioned a couple of different podcasts that I listened to that focus on language and that had episodes discussing textile words. One of those podcasts was Words Unraveled, which is hosted by Jess Zaferis, who has written several books on etymology, and Rob of the Rob Words YouTube channel. There's another podcast produced by Longthread Media, which are the publishers of Spin-Off magazine. That podcast focuses on textile-related topics, and they had Jess Zaferis of Words Unraveled as a guest recently, talking about textile terms and origins. One of the things that Jess talked about was the stir, the S-T-E-R ending in the word spinster, and talked about how that stir ending was used for all sorts of occupations that were held by women. So for example, a Weber was a male weaver while a Webster was a female weaver. And these exist as surnames even today. So other examples would be Brewster versus brewer, so if you were someone who made beer, or Baxter rather than baker, if you obviously were a baker. And again, these are still surnames that we see today. So I will leave a link to that podcast down in the show notes. Now, I'm not sure where this tidbit came from, but I'm pretty sure that it came up in my YouTube subscription feed because it's from the Absolute History YouTube channel, which I do subscribe to. So if one of you sent me this link as well, I apologize for not taking note of that. But it's a video called Grueling Jobs of Medieval Peasant Women. The video is about 25 minutes long, and while it's not related to textiles, it is related to women's labor through history, which I tend to find interesting, and my viewers do as well. The video talks about how women were typically forbidden from joining various trade guilds, including knitting guilds, but they could take over for an elderly parent or a spouse who had died. One of the things that I found especially interesting was the difference between a milkmaid and a dairymaid. It just never occurred to me that those were two different things. So milkmaids were the people who milked the cows, but the dairymaids were the ones who made butter and cheese, and that would be considered a higher level job than a milkmaid in the peasant classes. There were women who brewed beer, which I just mentioned in the previous tidbit, and they were called brewsters, and there were even women who were stonemasons. I, of course, will leave a link to that video down in the description below. One final tidbit. 2 weeks from today, I will be at the Minnesota State Fair in the Creative Activities Building, doing spinning demonstrations in the Weavers Guild booth. They've remodeled the interior of the Creative Activities Building, and they've taken out the old demo space where we used to be, and they put it somewhere else. So it'd be interesting to see how it is. So for those of you who've seen my Minnesota State Fair sort of roundup of the creative activities, I will absolutely film as much of the knitting as I can. We do have the largest knitting competition of any state fair. We're the largest state fair by daily attendance in the country. We have incredible knitting competition. I think there's somewhere around 50 knitting categories that people compete in that are just in hand knitting, because some hand knit things can be in table linens, which are competing against crochet or harding or other kinds of things. And anything that's for babies is in baby garments. It's not within the regular knitting. If you're doing toys, that will be in a category that has to do with soft toys, and it could be knitted or crocheted or whatever else. So there's a lot of knitting there besides, I'm not kidding, I think it's 50 categories. It's just an incredible amount. So I will be filming that like I normally do. Let me know if there's some sort of creative activity that you want me to make sure I film. There's so many things. There's woodworking, there's knitting, machine knitting, crochet, sewing, beading, weaving, spinning, quilting, all kinds of woodworking. I mean, there's always hand-carved canoes that are in the display booths. People make clocks. They do hardanger. They do embroidery. There's just a huge variety of things. And I try to find as many things as I can, but I tend to get overwhelmed myself. Going, oh my gosh. And I just want to look at it instead of, focusing on filming. But once again, I will try to film as much as I can. I will probably go to the fair sometime before the day that I am volunteering, because that's usually tiring, and so there's not a whole lot more I want to do besides that. But I do like to have one day where I'm just going there as a fair goer, enjoying everything. Let me know, though, down in the comments, if there's something that you would like to see at the fair, whether it's creative activities or not, and I will see what I can do. So since the last time I saw you, 2 weeks ago, I knit the Ranunculus sweater. I talked about why I'd chosen it and why it wasn't a sweater type or particular sweater that I had ever had any desire to knit before that, but I had very limited yarn, and so this was the solution for that. I will model it for you later on. I'm not wearing it now because it's August in Minnesota, which is why I'm wearing a sleeveless linen dress. It's going to be 88 degrees Fahrenheit here today, so not interested in trying to sweat my way through that. So I am going to talk about the modifications I made aside from gauge. That was a decision I had made last time when I knit this partial sweater here. I just wanted to understand how this was constructed, how it was going to fit, and how I could potentially make some modifications. I'm really glad I did this. I'll turn the angle up a little bit because I could try out the entire yoke. The yoke is knit the same regardless of what size you're knitting. So I could get a sense of how it would fit, especially with a different gauge. And I could see if there was anything that I wanted to tweak about it. So this will never be a finished sweater. The reason I chose this yarn is because it was leftover yarn in my stash. I wanted to know how many stitches it would take to get to the underarms and divide for the sleeves. So I can get the stitch count on that and see the yardage from this yarn and see, how far that would get me, and then do calculations in a spreadsheet based on the length of things that I wanted, and see if I was actually going to have enough yarn. When I did those calculations, it looked like it was going to be very, very close. So it's constantly monitoring the yarn usage and recalculating, how many stitches total stitches I could get out of the yarn I had, based on, how long I was going to be knitting different parts and what the running stitch count was, and just to make sure. So I want to go through the various modifications that I made, why I made those, and then I will tell you, what I think of this sweater and what I've learned from it, and some observations that I've made about it as well. Okay, the pattern is written with a couple of options in here, but essentially the yoke is designed to the same for every size, and the changes come when the patterning is over and how much you increase for the body and the sleeves after that. But there are two choices for the neck. In both cases, you're supposed to cast on 60 stitches based on a gauge of 3.5 stitches per inch, especially one that's loose for the yarn weight, which is going to make it stretchier. That should be enough to get over anybody's head. If you use the tubular or Italian cast on, then it's going to be a little bit closer fitting just because it's not going to stretch as much. But if you use this double twist cast on, that is just a really stretchy cast on, and it's going to automatically make it a little bit wider. Now, the thing that you do, this is 60 stitches for the ribbing, and then you're supposed to increase to 90 stitches. And so I've seen some people who are using a tighter gauge than what's called for, like maybe even tighter than what I'm using. And therefore, that's going to reduce the circumference of the neck. And so they don't want a neck that's even tighter than this. So what they do is they just cast on 90 for the ribbing, and that will make it a little looser, and then they don't do the increase here. I was doing the tubular cast on. I didn't really like the double twist and didn't feel as necessary for me. I didn't like how wide the stitches are when you use a regular tubular cast on. So I experimented with doing a twisted tubular cast on, and I did a Technique Tuesday video on that. I think it was last week. If you're interested in doing that. So I knew that that was a change I was going to make. Another modification I thought I would make, I went ahead and knit it into the swatch because I just didn't know what the purpose of it was, is that this called for short rows at the back, which is typical for a circular yoke, in order to raise the neck up a little bit. So there are short rows here, but and they just extend right out to the very edges of the shoulder. Normally, when you have some kind of a circular yoke, whether it's this kind of circular yoke or if it's a raglan that has a crew neck, the short rows would extend just past the shoulders, and then they would gradually get shorter. And the way this starts out is the shortest short rows, and then they get longer, but they just extend to here. And then on the front, there is it's not quite as deep or as wide set of short rows. And I really wasn't sure what the purpose of that was, because that's just going to raise the front of the neck. The only thing I could think of was that for some reason they wanted the shoulder to be shorter and the front and the back both to be longer, and that with the very loose gauge and the likelihood that the neck would stretch a lot, that would naturally add length on the shoulders. I really don't know. I think especially when you're knitting with a firmer gauge, one that's closer to the gauge of the recommended gauge of the yarn you're using, you're not going to have as much stretch, and so you might need to do things like the 90 stitch cast on, and you can eliminate these short rows. So I knew I was going to do that. And then the other thing that I wanted to do was not have as much ease in the body, as I was doing the smallest size and at a smaller gauge, but it was still would have ended up at 41 inches around, and I wanted something that was more like 38, 39. So I wanted it a couple of inches smaller, but with the smaller gauge, the sleeves were like smaller than I wanted. So right before it was time to do the increases below the texture pattern, you're supposed to place markers so you know where to do the increases. And what I did was look at what the where they were, and I decided I could take 1 inch, 4 stitches out of the front, so 2 stitches here and 2 stitches here, and put them on the sleeve, and then do the same on the back. And that would make the sleeves each 1 inch bigger, and it would make the body a total of 2 inches smaller, because you're taking 1 inch off the front and the back. And then that would give me the proportions I wanted, and I would know where to put those increases. So that was a decision that I made ahead of time, was change the cast on, eliminate the short rows in the front, and then shift the markers over so I could change the proportions. Now, there are a number of people who are like, oh, that's such a great idea. I didn't realize you could change that to get a better fit. So not only can you change that And that way you can have each section be a different size. So you don't have to have the front and back be exactly the same. If you're really busty and you want more of the stitches on the front, you can put fewer on the back. If you have a broad back, maybe you're not super busty, but you have a broad back, then you could have fewer on the front and more on the back. And presumably you'd want your sleeves to be both the same, but maybe you don't. Maybe you've got lymphedema in one of your arms and you need that sleeve to be bigger. So you just figure out, you know, the total circumferences that you want for each thing, and then figure out how to divide up the stitches that you have in order to make that fit. So if you want a more visual example, I have got a drawing and showing some calculations on how I figured out how to do that. I will link to the last Casual Friday where I explain that, and I believe there are chapter links so you can jump more quickly to that particular section. This is the actual sweater. Let's talk about some of the modifications that I made that I was thinking I might have to make but wasn't actually sure. My gauge on my swatch was 4 stitches per inch, which is smaller, made the circumference smaller by 6 inches. Changing it just that much made the total circumference 6 inches smaller for the body. But what was interesting about that big swatch is that my row gauge wasn't any different than the pattern. The pattern called for 3.5 stitches and 5 rows per inch, and I was getting 4 stitches and 5 rows per inch, which I thought was an unusual proportion. Normally with 4 stitches per inch, you might get 6 rows per inch. So I wanted to keep an eye on what was happening with my hand spun. And sure enough, I didn't have any problem getting 4 stitches per inch on the same needle. But I was getting a different row gauge. I was getting 6 rows per inch. And that meant that it was a shorter yoke than the original one was, because more rows per inch means you're pushing all of those rows into a smaller amount. So I tried it on and I was trying to figure out how much longer I wanted to make it. I tried on my swatch again and make sure it was fitting me under the arms where I wanted it. I laid them on the ground and how much difference is there. And I thought, okay, I'm probably going to need to add an extra, not quite 2 inches, but a good 1.5 inches or more to the length, which meant that in the 3 increase rounds, I would need to add more plain rounds. So the original size, the smallest size one, had you do an increase round, a plain round, and then 2 sequential increase rounds. What I did was I did the increase round, and then I think I did something like 4 plain rounds, an increase round, 4 plain rounds, and my final increase round. And my plan was to do another 3 or 4 plain rounds before I divided, but I tried it on. I thought, nope, this is long enough. So I did have more rounds than the original that I made, but fewer than I thought I would need by calculating. And again, this is the looser gauge, so it stretches more, but we've only got part of the sweater done. We don't have the full weight of gravity. So that was something I was keeping an eye on, was I knew I'd have to have more rounds than I would have with the other yarn for everything, but also that this was a looser gauge and I wasn't sure I would need all of the extra rounds. So what I decided to do, because my yarn was short and I really wasn't sure if I was going to have enough to get the length I wanted for the body and the sleeves, my second skein of hand spun ran out about right here. And so then I joined a new skein to the sleeves and knit those. Now, another change I made was to the length of the sleeves, and also the fact that I made them shaped. So the original pattern is so oversized that the sleeve is going to start down further, and they only want you to knit 7 inches, no shaping, and it's really more kind of a 3/4 length. It just depends on how big you end up making this. I usually, in a set-in sleeve sweater, need something that's about 17 inches. under here. So when I had this, just this much sweater, and I had enough, about 1 inch of the sleeve done, then I measured on my actual arm, I measured, you know, where the sweater was hitting and how long I wanted it down to my wrist. And I thought, okay, I'm going to need 17 inches. So I did my shaping calculations. I have a video on that. So if you ever need to recalculate your shaping because your row gauge is different or your arms are longer or shorter, there's some reason why you can't use the shaping rate in the pattern you're using, or you're designing something and you want to know how to do it. I have a video for that. So I was planning on 17 inches, but there was another change I wanted to make, which was to add some stitch patterning right before the cuff here. And I wanted to use something from the yoke. And this yoke was interesting to knit because the stitch patterns, you know, changed throughout. And so I wanted to figure out what I wanted to use. And did I want to use the same thing on the sleeves that I used on the body, or did I want to use one element from the yoke on the sleeves and different elements on the body? So I had the sleeve, you know, to figure this out. But I needed to keep trying this on to see how long the sleeve actually was. And I realized I was only going to need to knit at 16 inches because just over the length of it, you know, it stretches enough. I didn't need that. So I used some of the patterning here. It's this, there's a purl slip stitch pattern right here that I used. And then there's these patterns that are up here and here are very similar, but they use different stitch counts to produce them. And I liked the one that was up here more than I liked the way that this one worked out. So I did that on the bottom of the sleeves. And then rather than using a tubular twisted bind off for the sleeves, I just used a grafted twisted bind off. So there's no setup rows. It doesn't have that extra roundness at the edge that you get with any kind of tubular cast on or bind off. And I have a video for that as well. I'll leave that down below. The setup rows are always optional. So I got the sleeves done. And then as I was knitting, I was constantly calculating again how much yarn I have. And at one point I thought it was going to be, you know, really close in terms of just having a few yards left at the end. But again, as I was trying it on, this gets heavier and it pulls, you know, the weight down. And so I tried it on. I'm like, oh my goodness, I need to start this patterning right away. And then I ended up knitting the bottom ribbing. I'd originally planned on doing something like 14 or 16 rounds. I ended up doing 10 because I really didn't want it any longer, and I thought it looked fine. Oftentimes the sleeves, I like the sleeves to have longer cuffs than the bottom, and that was the case for this. So those are the modifications that I made. Otherwise, comments about, you know, the sweater. I think, you know, the hand spun is more textured than like a commercial yarn or even some of my other hand spun. You know, there was more little lumps and bumps in the roving as I was knitting and spinning it. I was pulling them out as I went, but you couldn't pull all of them out. So I was pulling out VM and I was pulling out little blobs. I'm still pulling VM out. So it's more textured, and I'm kind of glad that it has the amount of texture it has because it gives an overall effect rather than having, you know, one lump here and one lump here. But I ended up with quite a bit more yarn remaining than I did think I would have at one point. I thought I'd have, like I said, a few yards. I ended up with 45 grams remaining, which now I'm like, well, now what do I do with that yarn? Okay, I'm going to try it on now over my dress. I got to put the microphone down. So one of the things is, you know, I reduced the circumference so from 41 to about 39-ish. And even though I was checking the length of the yoke, you can see that it's, there's more room under here than I would really like. And some of, some of that comes from the gravity, and some of it comes from me not having a ton of experience estimating or knowing how long a yoke should be. But also, again, this is very loose gauge, and so it stretches more, and then you've got the gravity. So if I were going to do this again, I probably wouldn't have done as many plain rounds while I was doing the increase rounds. I think it's okay. It's not so big at the underarms that it really lifts my sweater up. Like if the underarms are really low and then you lift your arm up, it's going to lift the sweater up. So it doesn't do that. I think it fits me fine. It's okay. I don't love it. I think it's fine. And I'm worried about the looseness of the gauge is going to cause it to really pill. And we'll see how much it stretches out too. So I'll wear it, but it's not my favorite sweater. So again, I wouldn't knit this again, but having gone through this experience, I at least know what to expect from something like this. So like I said, it fits me. I'll wear it. I don't love it. I'm not going to knit another one again. I really love set-in sleeves. I just prefer that fit. I did lie a little bit earlier when I said that I'd never knit a circular yoke for myself, only it was just a partial lie. I have knit this sweater here. So this is from a pattern from the 1930s. And this is actually what's called an inset yoke. So the yoke fits within the shoulders. These are set-in sleeves. And the front of the bodice is shaped. You can see there's kind of these triangular shapes along the armhole and that go over to the bodice. It was a really ingenious construction method. So these are the sweaters that evolved into the circular yoke sweater. And they have the same issue. I mean, these inset yokes and the early circular yokes, really the circular yokes up to probably the 1970s when Elizabeth Zimmerman was like, hey, you know what? Let's put some short rows in these and drop the neck a little bit. They used to always just be knit the same, the front and the back, and that would cause the front of the neck to either be like this or the back of the neck to be up high, but hiking up the whole back of the sweater. These sweaters, some of them had that problem. This one had that problem, and I decided to put some short rows into this sweater so that the back wouldn't ride up. And it was tricky because, where do you put them? One place that some people, if it's hard to put them in the yoke, you can put them right under the yoke before the underarms. You could put short rows in there, but this had a very horizontal stitch pattern, and it would be really obvious if the middle of one of those stripes was getting wider and narrower. So I didn't want to do that. So I did put them in the bottom section, the bottom third. There were some short rows in there. I might have even put some, just in the bottom one. And that worked okay. Some of these 1930s inset yoke sweaters handled it, like they might be all stockinette, so there was no horizontal pattern there. And so what they would do, because they were knit bottom up, is that when they got to the underarm, they would just knit the back bodice longer, like an extra inch longer than they would knit the front. And that would place the yoke up higher, and it would naturally then cause the front of the yoke to drop down. So there are some ways of dealing with that. So ever since I knit this sweater, I've been wanting to design another inset yoke sweater for myself that has set-in sleeves and do something different with the yoke. And so that might be something that I want to do this winter is to get this figured out. This construction of the upper bodice that has that triangular shaping, that fills in all of that space and allows these set-in sleeves. It's just ingenious, and I just much prefer the fit of something like this to a regular circular yoke sweater. That's me. Other people have their preferences, and they are welcome to them. I'm not going to judge them for their preferences. I'm just maybe not going to agree with them. One reason that people have stated that they really love the Ranunculus is because it is so versatile. You can knit it at different gauges and get a closer fit. You can do various things with it. It kind of reminds me of when I learned to knit in the 80s. It was very easy. I felt as a beginning knitter, it was very easy to get a good fit, because a good fit meant that you could get the sweater over your head and the sleeves were the right length, because they were oversized drop shoulder sweaters. There was no fitting to be done. They weren't meant to be fitted. So it was really easy to get something that fit. And I think the Ranunculus falls into that category of, yeah, you can, it's forgiving of gauge. The thing I worry about, especially when using thinner yarns and a gauge that's closer to what you is recommended and not going with the 3.5 stitches per inch, is just that length of the yoke and understanding where it should hit for you. If you knit circular yokes a lot, you might have a better sense of if you're knitting at the recommended gauge, so the yarn isn't going, the fabric isn't going to pull down quite as much as it does with a really loose gauge. It's always going to pull down some, like knowing where that's supposed to hit. I think I have a pretty good idea where it should hit, but it's just the looseness of that gauge dragged everything down. I do see parallels with that. It's just the oversized drop shoulder sweater of the 80s reimagined as a circular yoke that has that will fit a wide range of body types without having to be fitted. So if you have a little bit of gauge problems, or you're a little short on yarn or whatever, it could work out really well for you. So that's it. That's my journey with the Ranunculus and my thoughts about the finished product. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below, or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.